Okay, so in this video we're actually going to talk about the loanable funds market as opposed to the money market, but they're paired and they're related markets, so hopefully this will help you kind of make sense of the two. Now I'm going to actually draw the graph and then we can kind of think about some of the ideas up here in the market section where I've written these notes out here as we do this. So the first thing, right, we've got, just like every other graph we do, we draw the axes and then we label them. Quantity of loanable funds, because it's the loanable funds market, and then this is going to be an interest rate and it's going to be sub R, and that's a really important real interest rate, right? It's the real interest rate, and that's because in the loanable funds market, we're actually talking about the borrowers, that's people who are borrowing, demanded by firms and households seeking to spend, and they are borrowing so they're responsive to the real rate. And we're talking about savers, where they're responsive to changes only in the real rate. Households and firms are going to supply more to these loanable funds if they get higher real rates, and a real rate is one that's adjusted for inflation. Now, we're going to have a downward sloping demand of loanable funds because as basically the interest rate rises, the opportunity cost goes up of borrowing money. It becomes more and more costly to borrow money, so they would quantity demand less. And then likewise, we have an upward sloping supply of loanable funds. And that's because as the interest rate rises, then people are willing and able to supply more of these loanable funds because the opportunity cost of not loaning it out is actually getting higher. So you would say, oh, gee, I really want to loan it out as the interest rate gets higher because not loaning it out costs you money in terms of an opportunity cost. Now we have I star for an equilibrium real interest rate and Q star for an equilibrium quantity of loanable funds. Now below this, I've written out some shifters of loanable funds supply and demand. And I'm actually going to make a little T chart right off to this side here that restates these. So we have supply and we have demand. And so as I talk through these, you can kind of think about what are these supply shifters. So the first one is actually the supply shifter is the central bank. And we'd say that this is only indirect. The central bank does not loan money to individual households or to firms, and that's who's borrowing the money. That's the demand for loanable funds. It's households and firms, and possibly, depending on your interpretation of this model, the government. But the Fed doesn't loan money to any of those people. The Fed, though, can control the money supply in banks, and so we would say that if there's an increase in the money supply, which would be shift to the right, then banks have more reserves that they can loan out, which would increase the supply and push the interest rate down. The second thing that could affect loanable funds supply, so again, just to be clear, if the central bank wants to, it can increase the supply of money, which actually increases loanable funds supply. So the second thing would be private savings. And so this is the idea that if firms and households decide to save more money instead of consuming, then that increases the supply of money that's out there and it would push down the interest rate. And just to be clear on this point, is as firms save, every dollar saved becomes a dollar loaned out to someone. So that's the savings investment identity, that if there's more savings, there's more dollars that are loaned out and it leads to more investment. So the third thing would be inflation. Now inflation, if there's higher inflation, would actually cut the supply of loanable funds. And the reasoning here is because if people are experiencing higher prices, they're going to need to use their money to consume. So it actually would reduce their savings. Because you'd say, geez, it costs twice as much to buy groceries this week, so that cuts into their savings rates. So this is kind of a subcategory here, if you will. And if there's higher inflation, then there's lower supply of loanable funds, and we have that down here. The fourth thing that could affect the supply of loanable funds are international flows of money. International flows, or capital flows, is one way to think about it. And I'm going to tell you a quick story to think about what this actually means. Imagine you have only like 2 countries in the world, and you, my video watcher here, have $10,000, and you have them in your savings account. And you can save those dollars either in the United States, or you could save them in the UK. And I'm just going to write that off here. You could have UK or the US. And you could get, we'll say, 4% interest, that interest rate in the US, or you could get 6% in the United Kingdom. And you have $10,000. Well, you would prefer to loan it out in the United Kingdom and get 6% instead of 4%. And so when you choose to do that, you flow your money over to the UK, the supply of loanable funds increases in the UK, and the supply of loanable funds decreases at the same time in the United States as you flow your money from the United States to the UK. So international capital flows, or the movement of money, can affect the supply of loanable funds in countries. Now, we have three changes that could affect demand for loanable funds. The first is actually government borrowing. Now, a brief word about this. This is one interpretation of government borrowing, and it's the idea that if governments don't take in enough taxes to pay for their spending, they have to borrow. So that increases the demand of loanable funds, and that's kind of right down here. So if governments increase borrowing, they do deficit spending, that sometimes is what it's called, then that increases the demand for loanable funds. Now, additionally, another model of this, and a fellow named Greg Mankiw, who's a professor at Harvard, he actually likes to model it slightly differently. He says it's better to not think about government borrowing as a demand shifter, because imagine if government borrowing increased, then you have D1, and that increases the interest rate, which is what happens. The interest rate would go up, and it would show the quantity rising of loanable funds being borrowed, right? The quantity of transactions would go up. The problem in his view is that kind of distorts the picture of what's really happening. That this increase is only happening because the government is borrowing. It doesn't tell us what's happening to private firms and individuals. So Mankiw argues that we actually should model government borrowing as a supply shifter, and that instead kind of think back to when we first talked about governments borrowing, it crowds out private investment. And we should say that when governments borrow, it doesn't change the demand. It actually it decreases the supply if they borrow more. And that causes the same higher interest rate, right, as they would if there was a demand shift. The higher interest rate still holds, but there's a decrease in the quantity. And that's because the government kind of gets first dibs on the dollars. And that's why they're sucked out of this market before they even get to private firms and households. And so from private households and firms' perspective, the quantity of loanable funds decreases. And so that's a more important thing to tell ourselves, because now we know, oh gee, there's less private borrowing going on, so there must be less investment spending, and that could slow the growth of the economy. So kind of two different ways that you could draw it. It doesn't matter on a test if you showed an increase in demand from more government borrowing or a decrease in supply. Either one, I would count it right. Now, the second thing that's a demand shifter would be private borrowing. So if people, like households and firms, private borrowing, let me write that out here, if they have the perception that the economy is going to do really, really well, they will want to expand their businesses. They'll say, okay, it's time to open a new restaurant, or it's time to open a new factory. And so they'll demand more loanable funds in response to perceptions of opportunities, right? So if they expect greater opportunities, they demand more loanable funds. But on the other side, like right now, there's a lot of uncertainty around the coronavirus here in the United States and elsewhere. And so not a lot of people would probably be demanding loanable funds because they don't really want to, they don't have expectations of opportunities, so it would decrease the demand for loanable funds. The third shifter of demand is inflation, once again. And again, just like with the government borrowing, you can actually model it on either side. If we said that there's higher inflation, we already established that the supply of loanable funds goes down. But if there's higher inflation, there's also an increase in demand for loanable funds. And both of those would produce a higher interest rate, right? Just kind of actually what we did with the government borrowing, and we said both of those could happen. But with inflation, people would demand more borrowed money, because think about those people that aren't saving, they're going to need to borrow more in order to finance their purchases. So there's higher inflation, it's going to cost more to buy the same amount of stuff, so people are going to say, gee, I need to borrow more, so that would increase the demand for loanable funds. Now, the last thing on this lecture notes series is actually called Long-Run Money Neutrality, and we actually talked about this once already when we went through this flowchart back here, where we said if price levels go up, demand for money goes up, long-run interest rates go up, and that lenders will charge higher interest rates in response to higher price levels. And that's basically what I've restated here for you, that in the short run, the money supply can affect output through interest-sensitive spending, but in the long run, the interest rate will come right back up again. So we have here, price levels go up, money demand goes up, and so if that happens, right, if money demand goes up, then the interest rate nominal goes up and the interest rate real goes right back up again. So we would find that ultimately the Fed is probably not as powerful as maybe we think it is because of this concept of money neutrality. Okay, so hopefully this helps you understanding the ideas behind the loanable funds market, and I'll see you next time.